Family sponsor, not family. That was what my seat card said at my granddaughter's wedding. Not grandmother. Not Evelyn Whitmore. Just 4 cold words printed in elegant gold lettering and placed carefully beside a centerpiece of white roses, as if humiliation could somehow become beautiful when wrapped in satin ribbon and candlelight. I stood there for a moment staring at the card while the string quartet played softly across the ballroom and guests laughed beneath towering crystal chandeliers at the Grand Willow Country Club outside Boston. Around me, waiters carried silver trays filled with champagne flutes and miniature crab cakes, while photographers rushed from table to table capturing smiling families dressed in designer gowns and tailored tuxedos. And somehow, in the middle of all that beauty, I had never felt more alone. I'm glad you're here with me today. Stay until the end of my story, and let me know where you're listening from, because sometimes the people who understand these stories best are strangers sitting quietly in another city carrying heartbreaks of their own. I adjusted the sleeve of my navy blue dress and forced myself to smile before anyone noticed the expression on my face. At 68 years old, I had learned something important about humiliation. The people who hurt you often watch closely for your reaction. Tears satisfy them. Anger entertains them. Silence unsettles them. So I picked up the place card carefully and sat down without saying a word. My table wasn't near the family section. It wasn't near Sophie and her new husband either. In fact, my seat had been placed beside the gift table near the ballroom entrance where distant business acquaintances and corporate sponsors were seated. A young waiter approached with a polite smile. "Good evening, ma'am. Are you with the donor group?" he asked. Donor group. I nearly laughed. Instead, I simply nodded once and accepted a glass of sparkling water because suddenly my throat felt too tight for champagne. Across the ballroom, my son Daniel stood beside his wife Claire greeting guests near the dance floor. Claire looked flawless in a pale silver gown that shimmered every time she moved. Beneath the lights, she laughed easily, touching people lightly on the arm as though warmth came naturally to her. Most people loved Claire within 5 minutes of meeting her. That was always her gift. She never raised her voice, never insulted anyone directly. Claire preferred quieter weapons. Exclusion, embarrassment, polite cruelty wrapped inside perfect manners. She noticed me looking toward them and raised her champagne glass slightly with a smile so smooth it almost looked kind. Almost. Then she turned away before I could respond. I looked around the ballroom again, trying to steady the ache rising in my chest. Sophie's wedding was beautiful. Of course it was. I had helped pay for nearly all of it. The floral arrangements alone probably cost more than my first car back in 1978. The venue overlooked a lake glowing beneath the summer sunset, and every table was decorated with ivory candles floating in crystal bowls. Sophie had always dreamed of a wedding like this, and I had wanted to give her that dream because loving someone sometimes means giving quietly without expecting applause in return. But as I watched the family gathering near the dance floor for photographs, I realized no one had called my name. No one had looked for me. The photographer lifted his camera while Daniel wrapped an arm around Claire, and Sophie leaned against her new husband, smiling brightly beneath the soft golden lights. My family stood together less than 50 feet away from me, and somehow there was no space for me inside the frame. I lowered my eyes to the place card again. Family sponsor, not family. The words blurred slightly for a moment before I blinked the tears away. Suddenly memories began surfacing one after another like pieces of broken glass rising through dark water. Christmas dinner moved to another date without anyone telling me. Family vacations I learned about from Facebook photos. Birthdays where my invitations somehow got lost in the mail. Every time, Claire had smiled sweetly and apologized with that practiced voice of hers. "Oh, Evelyn, there must have been some misunderstanding." For years, I convinced myself I was imagining things. I told myself families became busy, children grew up, life changed. But sitting there at that table beside the ballroom entrance while strangers walked past me carrying wrapped gifts for my own granddaughter, I finally understood something painful. None of it had been accidental. A woman at the neighboring table leaned toward her husband, speaking softly enough that she probably thought no one else could hear. "Claire told me Evelyn basically funded this entire wedding," she whispered. Her husband chuckled lightly. "Well, I guess every family needs a bank account." They laughed quietly together before returning to their dinner menus. I stared ahead at the dance floor while the orchestra began another song. My hands rested calmly in my lap. but inside something cold and heavy had started settling into place. Across the ballroom, Claire caught my eye once more. This time her smile looked victorious. The music grew louder as dinner service began, but somehow the ballroom felt colder with every passing minute. Waiters moved gracefully between tables carrying filet mignon and roasted potatoes beneath silver covers, while conversations blended into a soft wall of laughter and clinking glasses. I sat quietly near the entrance watching people drift toward the dance floor in little groups that formed naturally around family and friendship. No one drifted toward me. A young couple seated nearby spent 10 minutes debating whether they should leave early to relieve their babysitter. Across from me, an older businessman talked loudly about golf memberships in Palm Beach while checking stock prices on his phone between bites of steak. No one at my table knew who I was, and somehow that felt intentional. I folded my napkin carefully across my lap and glanced again toward the head table where Sophie sat glowing beneath the candlelight. Her wedding gown sparkled every time she turned her head, and for a moment, she looked so much like the little girl who used to run barefoot through my backyard chasing fireflies during summer cookouts that my chest tightened painfully. Sophie had spent almost every weekend at my house when she was growing up. Daniel and Claire were always busy back then. Claire had yoga, retreats and charity committees and spa weekends with her friends, while Daniel buried himself in work trying to build his investment firm. So Sophie stayed with me. We baked cinnamon cookies together every December. I helped her with science projects at my kitchen table. When she was 10 years old, she cried in my arms for 2 straight hours after her first school dance because another girl told her she looked awkward in her dress. You never let anyone decide your value, I told her that night while brushing tears from her cheeks. People who love you will never make you earn your place beside them. I wondered now if she remembered any of that at all. The wedding planner suddenly approached my table carrying a clipboard against her chest. She wore an exhausted smile stretched thin from dealing with wealthy guests all evening. Mrs. Whitmore, she asked politely, we are organizing immediate family for the sunset photographs outside by the lake. I nodded slowly and started to rise from my chair, smoothing the front of my dress automatically. But then her smile faltered slightly. Oh, I am sorry. Claire specifically asked for only parents and siblings in this set. The words landed softly, quietly, almost gently. But pain does not need volume to cut deep. Of course, I said calmly before sitting back down. The planner looked uncomfortable for a moment before hurrying away toward the dance floor. I watched through the ballroom windows as my family gathered outside beneath strings of glowing lights near the water. Sophie stood between Daniel and Claire while photographers adjusted cameras and guests admired the sunset reflecting off the lake. Everyone smiled easily, naturally, as though there was nothing missing from the picture at all. I reached for my water glass, but stopped when I noticed something else. Near the edge of the ballroom stood a giant memory display filled with framed family photographs from Sophie's childhood. There were pictures from birthdays, graduations, vacations, and Christmas mornings spread across decorative gold shelves surrounded by white orchids and candles. Curious, I stood slowly and walked toward the display while guests remained, distracted by the photography session outside. At first glance, the arrangement looked beautiful. Then I began noticing the gaps. There were dozens of photos featuring Claire's side of the family. Claire with Sophie at Disney World. Claire and Sophie shopping in New York. Claire's parents smiling beside birthday cakes and beach houses and ski resorts. But almost none of the photos included me. In one picture from Sophie's high school graduation, my shoulder appeared cropped awkwardly from the corner as though someone had intentionally cut me out. Another photograph showed Thanksgiving dinner at my own home 3 years ago, except the frame conveniently excluded the seat where I had been sitting at the head of the table. My stomach tightened slowly as understanding settled over me like cold rain. This had not happened overnight. Claire had been erasing me carefully for years, one photograph at a time, one holiday at a time, one exclusion at a time. Beautiful display, right? A familiar voice said softly beside me. I turned to find one of Claire's friends holding a champagne flute. Her name was Melissa, a woman with polished blonde hair and diamonds large enough to catch the ballroom lights every time she moved. Claire worked so hard organizing all this, she continued. She said it was important to highlight the people who were truly present in Sophie's life. Truly present. I looked back toward the photographs again. My hands remained steady at my sides. but inside something painful had begun shifting into something colder, more focused. I see, I replied quietly. Melissa smiled politely without realizing what she had revealed and wandered back toward the dance floor. Outside, applause erupted near the lake as Sophie and her husband kissed for another round of wedding photographs. Through the glass windows, I spotted Claire standing proudly beside the photographer, directing guests into place with effortless confidence. Then suddenly she turned and looked directly at me through the ballroom window. Even from that distance, I could see the satisfaction in her eyes. The ballroom slowly filled again as guests returned from the lakeside photographs carrying the warm glow of sunset conversations and expensive champagne. Someone laughed loudly near the bar, while the band shifted into softer jazz music for the dinner crowd. I remained standing near the family photo display for another moment, pretending to study the framed pictures, while my thoughts moved carefully through years of memories I had spent too long excusing. It is strange how the truth rarely arrives all at once. Most of the time it appears quietly, in pieces small enough to ignore until suddenly the pattern becomes impossible not to see. I remembered the Christmas 5 years earlier when Claire insisted they celebrate at a ski lodge in Vermont because Sophie wanted something different this year. Daniel called me 2 days before the trip, sounding distracted and apologetic. "The cabin only has limited room, Mom. We figured traveling in the snow might be hard on you anyway." Hard on me. I was 63 at the time and still walking 3 miles every morning along the harbor near my condo. But I told him I understood because mothers spend half their lives pretending disappointment is maturity. Then there was Sophie's 16th birthday dinner. Claire had smiled sweetly over the phone while explaining the restaurant had made a reservation mistake and there simply was not enough seating. A week later, I saw photographs online showing an entire extra table sitting empty near the back wall beside the windows. I had stared at those photographs for nearly an hour that night, wondering whether I had become too sensitive with age. Claire always made me question myself that way. She never slammed doors or shouted cruel things across a room. Her methods were cleaner than that, more sophisticated. She removed people slowly while making them feel unreasonable for noticing. "Evelyn." I turned at the sound of my name and found Daniel approaching me through the crowd with a champagne glass in one hand, and his tie loosened slightly around his neck. At 44, my son still had the same gray eyes he inherited from his father, though lately they seemed permanently distracted, as if part of him lived somewhere else entirely. "There you are," he said lightly. "Claire said you disappeared for a while." I studied his face for signs that he had noticed anything tonight. The seat card, the missing photographs, the family pictures by the lake without me standing beside them. But Daniel only looked tired. Not cruel, not guilty. Just absent, in the way some men become absent after years of letting stronger personalities make decisions for them. "I needed a little air," I replied calmly. He nodded without asking another question. Typical Daniel. As a little boy, he used to follow me through grocery stores, talking endlessly about dinosaurs and baseball statistics and whatever fascinated him that week. Now entire conversations passed between us without him truly seeing me at all. "The wedding turned out beautiful," he said after an awkward pause. "Claire worked really hard on this." There it was again. Claire. Always Claire. Every success in this family somehow carried her signature attached to it, like branding on expensive leather. "It certainly is memorable," I said quietly. Daniel smiled distractedly and glanced across the ballroom, where Claire stood speaking to several guests near the cake display. Even from a distance, she controlled the atmosphere effortlessly, guiding conversations with polished ease while waiters and planners hovered nearby, responding to her every request. Then Daniel lowered his voice slightly. "Listen, Mom, do not take some of the seating arrangements personally tonight. Claire has been under a lot of stress organizing everything." I looked at him carefully. "Did she tell you what my seat card said?" For the first time all evening, uncertainty crossed his face. "Seat card," he repeated. I reached into my purse and handed it to him without speaking. Daniel glanced down casually at first, but the moment he read the words, his expression tightened almost imperceptibly. He looked back up at me quickly. "I am sure this was some kind of joke from the event staff." I said nothing. Silence has a way of forcing people to hear themselves more clearly. Daniel shifted uncomfortably before handing the card back to me. "Claire would never intentionally hurt you," he added, though he sounded less certain now. Before I could answer, Laughter erupted nearby as Sophie entered the ballroom again holding her husband's hand while guests applauded. The band began playing louder, and servers rolled out a massive 5-tier wedding cake decorated with cascading white sugar flowers. Claire moved immediately towards Sophie, adjusting the train of her gown and positioning photographers for better angles, as if directing a performance she had spent years rehearsing. Daniel exhaled softly beside me. I should get back. Of course he should. He always returned to Claire eventually. I watched him disappear into the crowd before slowly making my way back toward my table near the ballroom entrance. As I sat down, 2 women nearby were already whispering over glasses of wine. Claire told me Evelyn insisted on paying for most of the wedding herself. One of them murmured. Apparently she likes having control through money. The other woman nodded knowingly. That explains the tension. I stared ahead at the glowing dance floor while a cold realization settled deeper inside me. Claire had not only excluded me tonight, she had rewritten me. To everyone in this ballroom, I was not a grandmother. I was a difficult old woman clinging to relevance through checks and financial favors. And suddenly I understood why Claire looked so satisfied every time our eyes met across the room. She had spent years carefully building this version of me for other people to believe. The first dance began a few minutes later beneath dimmed chandeliers and soft golden lighting that transformed the ballroom into something almost dreamlike. Sophie rested her head against her husband's shoulder while guests gathered around the dance floor smiling warmly and recording videos on their phones. Someone nearby dabbed tears from their eyes during the slower parts of the song. I remained seated near the entrance listening to the music drift across the room, while old memories kept surfacing one after another whether I wanted them to or not. There was a time when family events felt different. Before Claire entered our lives, holidays had been noisy and imperfect in the best possible way. Daniel used to arrive early on Thanksgiving mornings carrying grocery bags while pretending he knew how to help in the kitchen. My late husband Richard would complain every year about overcooked turkey before eating 3 full plates anyway. Sophie would sit on the counter stealing olives from vegetable trays while Christmas music played too loudly through the house. Back then I never worried about earning my place in the family because love did not feel conditional. Richard especially made certain of that. My husband had a quiet steadiness about him that filled every room without demanding attention. Even after 40 years of marriage, he still reached for my hand during long car rides and brought home fresh tulips every April because he remembered they bloomed during the month we first met. The last conversation we had before his heart attack was not dramatic or profound. He simply kissed my forehead one morning while reading the newspaper and said, "Promise me you will not let anyone make you feel small after I am gone." At the time I laughed and told him he worried too much. But sitting alone at that wedding reception nearly 6 years later, I finally understood what he had seen long before I did. Richard never fully trusted Claire. He remained polite to her because that was the kind of man he was. But sometimes after family dinners, he would quietly say things like, "That woman studies people the way businessmen study contracts." I used to defend her then. "She is ambitious," I would insist. "She just wants everything perfect." Richard would nod slowly but never argue. Looking back now, I realize he noticed the manipulation years before I did. Claire never attacked directly because direct cruelty leaves witnesses. Instead, she operated through atmosphere, through implication, through tiny humiliations spaced far enough apart to make you question your own instincts. After Richard died, it became worse. At first, Claire played the role of supportive daughter-in-law beautifully. She brought casseroles during the funeral week and hugged me gently in front of guests while speaking in soft, concerned tones. "We are all going to take care of Evelyn," she told people repeatedly. But once the sympathy faded and ordinary life returned, the exclusions quietly began multiplying. Family dinners moved to restaurants 40 miles away because Claire claimed the drive into the city was easier for everyone. Sunday visits became rare because Sophie suddenly had tutoring, tennis, internships, networking events, and social obligations almost every weekend. Even phone calls changed. Claire often answered Daniel's phone first and promised he would call me back later. Most of the time, he never did. I spent years excusing all of it because grief changes your confidence in strange ways. When you lose the person who loved you most completely, you begin doubting your own importance everywhere else too. A burst of applause pulled me back to the present as Sophie and her husband finished their dance. Guests cheered while the band transitioned into a more upbeat song, and couples flooded the dance floor laughing beneath spinning lights. Claire moved effortlessly through the crowd, greeting relatives and coordinating schedules with photographers as though she owned the entire evening. Perhaps in some way she did. Then I noticed an older man near the ballroom bar watching me carefully. At first I did not recognize him beneath the silver hair and dark tailored suit. But when he started walking toward my table, something familiar about his posture stirred an old memory. "Evelyn Whitmore," he said warmly as he reached me. "It has been far too long." My breath caught slightly. "Martin Hale?" He smiled gently. Martin had been Richard's attorney for nearly 20 years. He handled our estate planning, business contracts, and charitable foundations back when Richard still owned his construction company. I had not seen him since the memorial service. "You look beautiful tonight," Martin said politely before lowering himself into the empty chair beside me. "Although I suspect you are not enjoying yourself very much." I gave a quiet laugh without humor. Was it that obvious? Martin glanced briefly across the ballroom toward Claire before returning his attention to me. There was something unusually serious in his expression now. Richard once told me that if anything ever felt wrong after he passed away, I should pay attention. A slow uneasiness settled into my chest. "What do you mean?" Martin rested one hand against the tablecloth thoughtfully. "I mean your husband anticipated certain problems long before you did." The music continued loudly around us while guests danced and champagne glasses sparkled beneath the lights. But suddenly the ballroom no longer felt warm at all. Martin reached slowly inside his suit jacket and removed a thin sealed envelope. For a moment, I simply stared at the envelope resting in Martin Hale's hand while the sounds of the wedding continued around us, as though nothing important was happening at all. Laughter drifted across the ballroom. Glasses clinked softly beneath the chandeliers. The scent of expensive roses and candle wax lingered in the air while guests celebrated a future that suddenly felt very far away from me. Martin placed the envelope carefully on the table between us, but kept one hand resting lightly over it. "Richard asked me to hold this unless certain circumstances developed after his death," he said quietly. His voice remained calm, professional, but I could hear something heavier beneath it. "Concern. What kind of circumstances?" I asked. Martin glanced once more toward Claire across the ballroom. She was standing near Sophie now, adjusting the bride's veil for another round of photographs, while smiling warmly for guests watching nearby. "Perfect. Graceful. Believable. Patterns," Martin replied softly. "Manipulation involving family finances. Isolation. Attempts to influence inheritance structures." My stomach tightened slowly. "Richard thought that would happen?" Martin nodded once. "Your husband was a very observant man." I looked down at the envelope again. My hands remained folded calmly in my lap, but inside my thoughts had begun moving faster now, connecting memories I had tried for years not to examine too closely. "A few months before Richard passed away," Martin continued, "he requested a private review of all major transfers connected to family accounts and trusts." I blinked in surprise. Richard handled most financial matters himself during our marriage, but he rarely spoke about them in detail because he never wanted money to dominate family relationships. "He never mentioned any of this to me," I whispered. Martin gave me a sad smile. Because he hoped he was wrong. Across the ballroom, the band shifted into another upbeat song, while waiters began serving slices of wedding cake decorated with delicate sugar flowers. Guests moved happily between tables carrying champagne and coffee while cameras flashed near the dance floor. No one looking at our quiet corner near the entrance would have guessed my entire understanding of the last 6 years was beginning to shift. "What exactly did Richard discover?" I asked finally. Martin hesitated briefly before answering. He became concerned about how dependent Daniel and Claire were becoming on family assets. That did not surprise me entirely. Over the years, there had been constant requests presented as temporary situations or strategic investments. Help with Sophie's private school tuition. Assistance with the down payment on their larger home in Connecticut. Business opportunities Daniel wanted to explore. Charity gala sponsorships Claire insisted would strengthen social connections important for Daniel's career. Richard and I always helped because we believed families should support one another when possible. But now those memories felt different somehow. Less generous. More calculated. Martin lowered his voice further. "About 18 months before his death, Richard noticed unusual transfer requests connected to a family development account. I frowned slightly. What kind of requests? Martin opened the envelope carefully and removed several folded documents. Payments routed through limited liability corporations associated with Claire Bennett. My eyes moved slowly across the paperwork, though the legal language blurred together at first beneath the ballroom lights. Then certain numbers became painfully clear. Large numbers. Transfers connected to event consulting, hospitality coordination, charitable management services. I do not understand, I admitted quietly. Martin pointed gently toward one section. Richard suspected Claire had been quietly redirecting portions of approved family expenditures through businesses she controlled. I looked up sharply. Are you saying she stole from us? Martin chose his next words carefully. I am saying Richard believed certain financial arrangements deserved closer examination. Even now he remained cautious. Professional. But I saw enough in his expression to understand the truth hiding underneath his restraint. My pulse began beating harder as memory after memory returned with terrifying new clarity. Claire insisting on handling charitable event vendors personally. Claire volunteering to organize family travel arrangements. Claire encouraging Daniel to consolidate accounts for simplicity. I had mistaken control for competence because women like Claire build trust through efficiency first. Then they slowly begin rewriting boundaries until generosity becomes entitlement. Why tell me tonight? I asked. Martin carefully gathered the papers together again before answering. Because this wedding created new activity involving those same business structures. I stared at him. What kind of activity? Martin's jaw tightened slightly for the first time all evening. Inflated invoices. Vendor routing irregularities. Transfer approvals submitted under your family foundation. A cold heaviness settled fully into my chest now. I funded this wedding, I whispered. Martin nodded quietly. Yes, you did. Across the ballroom, Sophie laughed as her new husband fed her a bite of wedding cake, while guests applauded and raised their phones to capture the moment. Claire stood nearby, glowing beneath the lights like the architect of a flawless evening. Then suddenly she looked toward our table. Even from across the crowded ballroom, I noticed the exact moment she recognized Martin sitting beside me. Her smile froze almost invisibly for half a second before returning smoother than before. But I had already seen it. Fear. Claire recovered quickly. That was the unsettling thing about people like her. Fear only appeared for a fraction of a second before disappearing beneath polish and composure. By the time she crossed the ballroom toward our table, her smile looked effortless again. Warm, elegant, perfectly rehearsed. Martin Hale, she said brightly as she approached us. What a surprise. I did not realize you were invited. Her tone remained pleasant enough that no one nearby would have noticed the tension hidden beneath it. Martin rose politely from his chair. Good evening, Claire. She leaned slightly toward me then, resting one manicured hand lightly against the back of my chair in a gesture designed to appear affectionate to anyone watching. Evelyn, there you are? We have all been looking for you. No, they had not. But Claire understood appearances better than anyone I had ever known. Family image mattered deeply to her, because image was how she controlled perception. I needed a quiet moment, I replied calmly. Claire's eyes drifted briefly toward the envelope still resting near Martin's hand before returning to me. Just another tiny flicker. Another almost invisible crack in the surface. Well, she said smoothly. It is almost time for speeches, and Sophie would love having everyone closer to the dance floor. Everyone. The same everyone who forgot my seat near the entrance. Martin watched Claire carefully, but said nothing. He did not need to. The silence itself had begun changing shape now. Claire felt it too. I could tell by the subtle stiffness settling into her shoulders despite the smile still resting on her face. You planned a beautiful evening, I told her quietly. Claire tilted her head slightly. Thank you. Sophie deserves perfection. The answer sounded innocent enough. Yet something about the way she said perfection made it feel less like love and more like ownership. Then Daniel appeared beside her carrying 2 champagne glasses. There you are, he said with visible relief when he saw Claire. The photographer needs immediate family near the stage in 10 minutes. Immediate family. The phrase settled coldly inside me. Claire accepted one of the champagne glasses gracefully before touching Daniel lightly on the arm. I already asked Evelyn to join us closer to the front, she said sweetly. Daniel smiled distractedly, clearly eager to avoid tension. Good. Perfect. But I noticed something else now. For the first time all evening, Daniel looked tired around Claire. Not fearful exactly. Just worn down in the quiet way people become after years of constantly adjusting themselves around someone stronger. Claire reached for his wrist gently. Come help me check the seating for the speeches, she said. I think the planner moved the donors again. Donors. Even now she could not help herself. Daniel nodded automatically and followed her back toward the center of the ballroom without another glance at me. Martin waited until they disappeared into the crowd before speaking again. Your husband used to say Claire never wasted language accidentally. I let out a slow breath. I hear it now. Around us, the ballroom glowed brighter as evening deepened outside the tall windows overlooking the lake. Candles flickered across tables covered in ivory linen, while waiters refreshed wine glasses and guests settled into their seats for speeches. Somewhere near the stage, Sophie laughed at something one of her bridesmaids whispered. Everything looked beautiful, refined, civilized. Yet beneath all that elegance, I could suddenly feel years of manipulation sitting quietly beneath the surface like cracks beneath ice. Martin slid the envelope toward me carefully. There is more, he said softly. I looked at him without opening it yet. How bad is it? His expression remained measured, potentially very serious. My pulse quickened slightly. Financially, Martin nodded once. And legally, depending on intent. I lowered my eyes toward the envelope again. The paper suddenly felt heavier than it should have. Richard really believed she was capable of this. Martin folded his hands together thoughtfully before answering. Richard believed Claire viewed family relationships as assets to manage rather than people to love. The truth of those words settled painfully into me because deep down I had known it for years. I simply did not want to admit it. Claire never loved family in the ordinary sense. She loved influence, access, position, being admired at charity galas and country clubs, being photographed hosting events in magazines nobody actually read. Family was part of the image she built around herself. And I had become inconvenient because I reminded everyone that the Whitmore family existed before Claire arrived to redesign it. Suddenly, the microphone near the stage crackled softly. Ladies and gentlemen, the wedding coordinator announced warmly, we will begin speeches in just a few moments. Guests applauded lightly while servers cleared dessert plates from tables. Claire stepped gracefully onto the stage beside Sophie, adjusting the microphone height herself while smiling toward the crowd with effortless confidence. Then her eyes found me again near the ballroom entrance. This time she did not smile at all. For several long seconds we simply looked at one another across the crowded room while music faded into silence around us. And in that moment I realized something important. Claire no longer saw me as weak tonight. She saw me as dangerous. Claire began the speeches with the kind of polished confidence that made people instinctively trust her. She stood beneath soft golden lights, holding the microphone delicately in one hand while the ballroom quieted around her. Thank you all for being here tonight, she said warmly. Family means everything to us, and seeing everyone gathered together for Sophie and Nathan is truly a blessing. Guests smiled and nodded while servers paused respectfully near the walls. Claire knew exactly how to perform sincerity because she understood most people never look beyond appearances. This wedding would not have been possible without the incredible support of so many people, she continued gracefully, especially those who believe in investing in family traditions and meaningful memories. Investing. There it was again. Her language always drifted toward transactions eventually. Claire turned slightly, then, and smiled toward my table near the ballroom entrance. Evelyn has always been very generous financially with our family, she said. And we appreciate everything she has contributed over the years. Contributed. Not loved. Not sacrificed. Contributed. Like a corporate donor acknowledged during a fundraising gala. A few guests politely glanced toward me with practiced smiles, while others clapped softly. I sat perfectly still with my hands folded in my lap as the applause faded around the room. Claire continued speaking smoothly about Sophie's childhood, about family milestones, about building a legacy for future generations. Yet somehow every story positioned Claire at the emotional center of it all. Claire helping Sophie prepare for college interviews. Claire organizing holiday traditions. Claire guiding the family through difficult years after Richard's passing. Listening to her felt like watching someone slowly repaint history while the original version disappeared underneath each careful brushstroke. Then Claire lifted her champagne glass towards Sophie and smiled beautifully beneath the chandeliers. "To family," she said softly. "The people who show up for each other." More applause followed. Around me, guests raised glasses while the band played a gentle instrumental melody in the background. Claire handed the microphone back toward the wedding coordinator and began stepping away from the stage. "Actually," I heard myself say calmly, "may I say something as well?" The room quieted again almost immediately. Claire stopped walking. For the first time all evening, genuine uncertainty crossed her face before she smoothed it away. Sophie looked surprised, but smiled politely toward me. "Of course, Grandma," she said. "Grandma." Interesting how quickly the titles changed when an audience was watching. I rose slowly from my chair and walked toward the stage while dozens of eyes followed me across the ballroom. My navy blue dress brushed softly against the polished floor, and the place card remained tucked quietly inside my purse like a small sharp secret. Martin Hale watched silently from the back corner of the room. Daniel looked uneasy now, shifting his champagne glass nervously between his hands while Claire stood rigid beside him. I accepted the microphone gently once I reached the stage. For a moment, I simply looked around the ballroom, taking in the candlelight, the expensive flowers, the smiling guests, the glowing lake visible through towering windows behind the dance floor. Then I smiled softly. When my husband Richard and I first started our lives together, I began quietly. We lived in a tiny apartment above a hardware store in Providence. A few guests laughed warmly. The ceiling leaked every winter, and our first dining table was an old card table with one uneven leg. Sophie smiled faintly, listening now. But Richard used to tell me something whenever life became difficult. He said family should never feel like a transaction. The ballroom grew still again. Not debt, not obligation, not performance. I let the silence settle naturally before continuing. Real family makes you feel wanted before you ever offer them anything. Claire's expression hardened almost invisibly near the dance floor. Daniel glanced toward her uncertainly. "Tonight has been beautiful," I continued gently. "And I am proud of Sophie. I truly am. But sitting in this ballroom, I found myself thinking about how easily people can confuse generosity with weakness." No one moved now. Even the servers stood quietly near the walls listening. Sometimes the person paying for dinner is also the person eating alone. A strange tension spread softly through the room. Subtle, uncomfortable. Guests shifted in their seats while Claire crossed her arms carefully against her silver gown. "Richard believed family should protect one another," I said. "Especially after loss. Especially after grief." My eyes drifted briefly toward Daniel. "And sometimes when someone spends years making another person feel small, invisible, or useful instead of loved, they forget something important." Claire no longer looked calm now. "Eventually," I said softly, "the invisible person begins noticing everything." Complete silence filled the ballroom. Then slowly, without raising my voice once, I reached into my purse and removed the folded place card. I held it up carefully beneath the chandelier lights for everyone to see. Several guests leaned forward instinctively, trying to read the words from their tables. Claire's face lost color almost immediately. "This," I said quietly into the microphone, "was my assigned seat tonight." The silence that followed felt heavier than any shouting ever could have. Guests stared at the small place card in my hand, while soft instrumental music continued awkwardly in the background as though the band did not yet realize the atmosphere inside the ballroom had completely changed. Claire stood frozen beside the dance floor, her champagne glass still resting delicately in one hand, though she no longer looked elegant or composed. For the first time since I had known her, she looked cornered. "Evelyn," Claire said carefully, forcing a small laugh that sounded painfully unnatural now. That was obviously some kind of seating joke from the event staff. No one laughed with her. I lowered the card slowly and looked directly at her beneath the chandelier lights. "Really?" I asked softly. "Then perhaps you can explain why my photographs disappeared from the family display too." A murmur moved quietly through the ballroom as guests turned instinctively toward the memory wall near the entrance. Several people immediately began whispering to one another while studying the display more closely now. Claire's expression tightened another fraction. "This is not the time for drama," she replied smoothly. though her voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. Drama. Interesting word choice from a woman who had quietly orchestrated humiliation all evening. Daniel stepped forward, then looking deeply uncomfortable. "Mom," he said quietly, "maybe we should talk privately." I turned toward my son slowly. "Privately?" I repeated. "You did not seem concerned about privacy when your mother was seated beside the gift table." Daniel opened his mouth, but no words came out. Across the room, Sophie looked pale now, her eyes moving nervously between me and Claire, as if she could no longer understand the version of the evening unfolding in front of her. "Grandma," she whispered softly, "I did not know about the card." And perhaps she truly did not. Sophie had spent years growing up inside Claire's carefully managed world. Children raised around manipulation often mistake it for normal behavior because they never learn the difference. I nodded gently toward her. "I believe you." Claire immediately stepped closer to Sophie protectively. "This entire situation is being blown out of proportion," she said sharply now. "Tonight is supposed to be about Sophie and Nathan, not old resentments." There it was. The first crack. The first glimpse of irritation beneath the polished surface. Martin Hale rose quietly from his seat near the back of the ballroom then. "Actually," he said calmly, "I think the concerns raised tonight extend beyond seating arrangements." Claire turned toward him instantly. "Excuse me." Martin adjusted his suit jacket with professional calm. "I reviewed several financial transfers connected to this wedding before attending tonight." Complete stillness spread across the room again. Daniel frowned immediately. "What transfers?" Claire answered before Martin could speak. "Legal paperwork has nothing to do with this evening." But now her composure looked strained. Tight around the eyes. Tight around the mouth. Martin remained calm. Approximately 30% of vendor payments connected to this event were routed through consulting companies associated with Claire Bennett. Several guests exchanged startled looks. Sophie stared at her mother in confusion. "Mom." Claire laughed again too quickly. "That is completely normal for event management." Martin nodded slightly. "It would be, if those charges reflected actual market rates." The ballroom seemed to shrink inward around us. Even the servers had stopped moving now. Claire crossed her arms tightly against her silver gown. "You have no right discussing private finances at my daughter's wedding." Martin's expression never changed. "I was invited tonight specifically because Richard Whitmore anticipated situations exactly like this." The mention of Richard's name shifted something instantly. Daniel looked stunned. Sophie blinked rapidly as though trying to process everything at once. And Claire finally stopped pretending to smile entirely. "What exactly are you implying?" she asked coldly. Martin looked directly at her. "I am implying that certain family assets appear to have been manipulated over several years under the appearance of event coordination and charitable administration." Gasps moved quietly through the nearest tables. One woman near the bar lowered her champagne glass halfway, without realizing it. Daniel looked at Claire now with visible confusion. "Claire, what is he talking about?" She turned toward him sharply. "Do not do this here." "Answer him," I said quietly. Claire's eyes snapped toward me with open anger now. Not polished irritation. Not graceful annoyance. Anger. "You really want to destroy your granddaughter's wedding because your feelings got hurt over a seating card?" she asked bitterly. I held her gaze calmly. "No, Claire. You destroyed this evening the moment you decided humiliation was acceptable as long as it looked elegant." Silence followed. Heavy. Unavoidable. Sophie looked down slowly at the floor beneath her wedding gown while tears gathered in her eyes. "Did you really do that?" she whispered toward her mother. Claire immediately softened her expression towards Sophie again. "Sweetheart, this is all being twisted." But Sophie was no longer looking at her mother now. She was looking at me. Really looking at me for perhaps the first time in years. Then quietly, almost trembling, she asked the question that finally shattered whatever remained of the illusion Claire had spent years building around this family. "Grandma, were you really sitting alone the whole night?" The question hung in the ballroom like smoke after a fire. Sophie stood motionless beneath the chandelier lights, her wedding bouquet trembling slightly in her hands while tears gathered along her lashes. Around her, guests avoided eye contact with one another in that deeply uncomfortable way people do when politeness can no longer hide the truth sitting openly in front of them. I looked at my granddaughter for a long moment before answering. "Yes," I said softly. "I was." Sophie's face crumpled with quiet heartbreak. Not dramatic. Not loud. Just the slow, painful realization that someone she trusted had carefully shaped her understanding of another person for years. Claire stepped toward her immediately. "Sweetheart, do not let tonight become something ugly," she said gently, reaching for Sophie's arm. But Sophie moved away, just slightly, barely noticeable to most people. Yet to a mother like Claire, it might as well have been an ocean. Daniel noticed it too. I saw the exact moment something shifted inside my son as he looked between his wife and his daughter, and finally began recognizing the damage hidden beneath years of polished appearances. "Claire," he said quietly, "did you really put Mom at that table on purpose?" Claire exhaled sharply, frustration finally overtaking her carefully rehearsed calm. "I was managing 300 guests, Daniel. Not every little detail was some grand conspiracy." But even she no longer sounded convincing. Not after the photographs. Not after the financial questions. Not after the card. Daniel rubbed one hand across his face slowly, like a man waking from a long, exhausting dream. "Then why were her pictures removed from the family display?" Claire opened her mouth, but stopped. No smooth answer came this time. Because some truths cannot survive once enough people finally look directly at them. Martin Hale remained quietly near the back of the ballroom, observing everything with the patience of a man who had spent decades watching families destroy themselves over pride, money, and control. The band had stopped playing entirely now. Candlelight flickered softly across untouched wedding cake and half-finished champagne glasses, while the beautiful evening Claire spent months orchestrating slowly collapsed beneath the weight of honesty. Sophie turned toward me again then. "Grandma," she whispered, "why did you never tell me?" I smiled sadly. "Because I kept hoping I was wrong." Tears slipped down Sophie's cheeks now. "You used to make me pancakes shaped like snowflakes every Christmas morning," she said softly. "You drove 6 hours to watch my college choir concert in Vermont during a snowstorm." Her voice broke. "How did I let this happen?" Claire immediately stepped forward again. "Sophie, enough." But Sophie looked at her mother differently now. Not with admiration. Not even with anger yet. Just confusion. Deep, painful confusion. "Did you really think Grandma was trying to control us with money?" Sophie asked quietly. Claire folded her arms tightly. "I think your grandmother enjoys being needed." "No," I said softly. Every eye in the ballroom returned toward me again. "I enjoyed being loved." Silence followed. Complete silence. Daniel lowered his eyes toward the floor. Sophie cried quietly into one hand while guests stared into champagne glasses, pretending not to listen even though no one could look away anymore. Then something unexpected happened. One of the older women seated near the center tables slowly stood up, holding her purse against her side. "Evelyn always hosted the best Christmas dinners," she said gently into the silence. "Richard adored her." Another guest nodded quietly. Then another. Small comments. Small truths. Yet together they began rebuilding something Claire had spent years trying to erase. Presence. Memory. Humanity. Claire looked around the ballroom, realizing too late that social power disappears quickly once people stop admiring the performance. Daniel finally stepped toward me then. His face looked older somehow, worn down by regret settling in all at once. "Mom," he said quietly, "I should have noticed." I studied my son for several long seconds. The little boy who used to fall asleep on my shoulder during long drives home from Little League games was still somewhere inside the exhausted middle-aged man standing in front of me now. But pain changes people. Silence changes them too. "Yes," I replied gently. "You should have." Daniel closed his eyes briefly, like the truth physically hurt. Claire looked at him in disbelief. "You are taking her side?" she asked sharply. Daniel turned slowly toward his wife. "I do not even know what side we are on anymore." That answer seemed to shake Claire more than anything else tonight, because for the first time in years, she no longer controlled the narrative inside the room. Sophie walked toward me carefully then and wrapped her arms around me, without caring who watched. I held her quietly beneath the soft ballroom lights, while photographers lowered their cameras uncertainly, and wedding guests sat in uncomfortable silence around us. Outside the tall windows overlooking the lake, the reflection of the chandeliers shimmered across dark water like fractured stars. After several moments, Sophie pulled back, wiping tears from her cheeks. "I am sorry, Grandma," she whispered. I touched her face gently. "So am I." Then I reached into my purse one final time and removed the place card. Before setting it carefully down on the nearest table beside the candles and untouched champagne. I looked at the words once more without anger now. Just clarity. Family sponsor. Not family. Strange how the cruelest thing about that sentence was not the insult itself. It was how long I had allowed other people to decide whether I belonged.